Hello and welcome to Telluric Vibrations Day 4. We just started the day, had our very first talk by Clarissa Ribeiro, and we're now going to go into Anna Dumitriu's presentation called Collateral Effects, the Hidden Effects of the Pandemic. Anna Dumitriu is a British artist who works with bioart, sculpture, installation, and digital media to explore a relationship to infectious diseases, synthetic biology, and robotics. Her past exhibitions include ZKM, Ars Electronica, Beaux-Arts, the Picasso Museum, HK Basel, Science Gallery Detroit, MoCA Taipei, Laboreal Art Laboratory Berlin, and the Eden Project. She holds visiting research fellowships at the University of Hertfordshire, Brighton, Sussex Medical School, and Wags Society, as well as artist in residency roles with the Modernizing Medical Microbiology Project at the University of Oxford and with the National Collection of Type Cultures and Public Health England. You can visit her website at annadumitriu.co.uk. And if you enjoy this talk, you should then click within the next hour because there's going to be a discussion between Anna Dumitriu and Sarah Popelka called Climate Change and the Virusphere, which will hopefully kind of continue the topics that are discussed in this one. So I will now hand it over to Anna and enjoy the talk.
I'm Anna Dumitriu and I'm an artist based in the UK, and I've been reflecting on what the collateral effects of the pandemic might be, both in my own work and in the work of the scientists I collaborate with, and more broadly in terms of the future of technology and biotechnology and the perspective of the public on bioart, biomedical art and art and science practice. I was very aware that the pandemic might be an issue because I follow infectious disease scientists, and I've been following the stories coming out of China from January, and actually one of our projects called Archaeobot, an exhibition got postponed in February that was supposed to be in Beijing because of the pandemic there. But I became strongly aware that it was getting close, was at the end of February. I exhibited Cyberspecies Proximity, a work that I made through a STARTS residency at Schindler in collaboration with the digital artist Alex May. That piece was shown at Saint-Quatre in Paris in a very busy gallery, and as we were there during the exhibition, the signage started to go up about washing your hands and sanitizers and things like that. And so we were very aware, but there was no restrictions at the time. And it actually seemed very poignant in terms of the artwork that we made, because we were working with Schindler on this project called Cyberspecies Proximity, which was about a future, the idea of future cities where we live and work with robots, and where there are increasing robots in our cities moving around, delivery robots, worker robots. I mean, in fact, the term robot actually means worker. It's derived from a Czech word for worker. So there's this kind of idea that the robot is there to do our bidding. That has a very long history. In fact, in the original idea of the robot, they were biological organisms. But working with Schindler, who are one of the largest elevator companies in the world, they're focused on very much what the future of cities will look like, how to move people around with cities. And they've been working with lift installation robots. They've been working with robots that will maintain elevators, and also working in hospital settings, for instance, with these kind of transportation delivery robots. And something we were interested in the piece that we made is to create a robot that we would be able to think about in terms of if it could actually interact with us. We were fascinated in stories about, we heard about a library in the United States where people hated this like book transport robot. It was carrying like heavy books around the library and things, and people hated it. And then somebody came up with the idea of putting some eyes on the robot, and it became kind of the mascot for the robot. So humans are very easy to manipulate in terms of robotics, and robots can draw us in. But there are these, and then this manipulation makes it so complex because there are a lot of kind of prejudices in robots. Service robots tend to have female voices. Robots tend to be white. The overall colour of 80% or so of robots is white. And so there are a lot of biases that occur in robotics that actually tell us a lot about ourselves. So our robot, it's playing with this idea of the kind of the clothing of the worker, and it has a small body. It's kind of insignificant in a way, and it's not a human colour. If anything, we picked the colour grey for it. We thought about a lot of different colours, and actually, when you're thinking about the colour of a robot, it's such a complex issue. Every colour says something. So grey is this kind of fading into the background colour, but also can be the colour of death, of a dead robot. So or a dead human would be like this. So it's got these kind of qualities to it, and it seems quite fragile, in need of help, maybe sickly in a way, but there to do our bidding, and it's this kind of tension that we want to bring up in our work. Like this is this tension of the promise of technology versus the issues with that technology. And the aim of our artworks in this area is to raise these questions. And it was really interesting working with Schindler and raising these questions about the decision-making process that they go through. And actually we saw changes in the way that they were working and the way that they were thinking by having artists present in their new technologies lab. And it was absolutely fascinating to work in an engineering company, a big corporate setting with very experienced engineers, and it really brought another element to our work. But also thinking about this idea of the delivery robot, that becomes then a huge thing during the pandemic, the idea of delivery robots, because delivery, all our food gets kind of delivered. Everyone's using delivery services much more now. We get our shopping delivered, we can get our meals delivered every night, and we have so much access to this. But humans still are the vector of infection with COVID, with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Is being spread by human to human interaction. That's why social distancing is so important. And although robots, like all other kind of inanimate objects, could potentially carry the fomites of infection, they don't have that ability to cough, so the risks are reduced. So we were thinking about this idea of robots as delivery robots, and one of the kind of the leading people in the field trying to introduce them said a while back that they had this vision of thousands of robots in thousands of cities around the world doing delivery. And we were starting to think about who owns the pavement, who owns the sidewalk. What about elderly people sitting on the pavement? What about homeless people on the sidewalks or pavements? And it becomes this much more kind of conflicted issue of how do we implement these things and get the benefits from them. Aside from this idea of, how do we treat robots, and what does that say about us? So this idea of technoethics, robot ethics, is a really interesting one. For instance, some sex robots have been given, like you have to kind of get consent from the sex robots, which is a very interesting thing, because technically it's an inanimate object, but there's this idea that we kind of, the moral impetus is on humans, and that we can learn bad habits from how we interact with robots. So when you have a robot vacuum cleaner and it's kind of annoying you, would you kick it? Would you jostle a robot in an elevator with you? So these things can kind of happen. And so we were very interested in what if that robot could interact with you in terms of body language and how it sort of seems around you, and it can react to you. So the robot we've made, it glides around the space on a self-balancing base, and it has the ability to observe your movements and your gestures, and it has a library of reactions which is increasing and growing the more it's exhibited, which it hasn't been much because the shutdown came shortly after that exhibition. And we modelled the robot working with the scientists at Schindler, and it's based on a lot of our previous work in the field. But it's this question of the hygiene and the use of these kind of delivery robots becomes very central. And you could print them in copper, which is shown to like the head and the hands, or the hands could be printed in copper, which would reduce perhaps infection and things. So it's not exactly meant to be a design solution. It's meant to be something that raises our awareness of these issues and these thoughts. And it uses SLAM technology to create an idea of the space, so it can move around, this simultaneous localization and mapping algorithms. So, and it uses multi-layered face, skeleton and movement tracking. During the pandemic, one of my other upcoming exhibitions was delayed, which was a show with my plague dress, which is actually, I do a lot of work around infectious diseases, and it's antibiotic resistance and infectious diseases is one of the biggest areas of my work, and something that I'm really passionate about dealing with and raising awareness of. So throughout all my work, there's these issues of technology. What does that mean for us? What do we need to think about that we're not thinking about? And these kind of threads across time, so the history of the field moving forward. And this piece, it kind of made links between the Silk Road and the vectors of disease with the Great Plague of 1665 in London, and uses the herbs that would have been in the beaks of the plague doctors' masks, and it's stuffed full of lavender and turmeric and different things. It's dyed with walnut, which the herbalist Culpeper said could be preventative to plague. It's embroidered, it's a dress design from 1665, and it's embroidered with actual period embroidery from then is attached to it. It's appliqued on it, and onto that applique I've embedded the extracted DNA of Yersinia pestis, the plague, which I extracted in the lab at the National Collection of Type Cultures, the oldest collection of pathogenic bacteria in the world, where I'm their artist in residence. And in many ways it's a dream job for me, because it brings together this idea of the history of the disease and the latest cutting edge technology with genomics and research that's being done now. And it's fascinating what they're revealing. And that piece has finally now opened in its second exhibition, because it was delayed due to the pandemic, at the Rijksmuseum Boerhaave in Leiden, which is a fantastic location for it because it's in the site of a former pest house for plague victims, and it holds the collection of Van Leeuwenhoek's microscopes, so the first microscopes where bacteria were seen ever in the world are in the same building. So it's a fantastic honour to have that piece there, and I'm really pleased that the show has now opened, and it's a show about the risks of coming pandemics. But obviously the show was planned, and the show's called Contagious, and it was planned long ago, several years ago. So it's interesting. It's not like the world wasn't aware that this stuff might be happening. If you watch films like Contagion, I mean, 80% of the film is almost correct for what's happening now. So it's not like people didn't have an awareness. It's just we seem to have this thing which is called optimism bias, where we just can't really keep in our minds that this thing really could happen and kind of deal with it. And a lot of these things are kind of very insidious. So a lot of my work's around this idea of antibiotic resistance and what might happen, what is happening as bacteria gain antibiotic resistance genes, so they can still live in the presence of different antibiotics. And antibiotic resistance is not a new thing. It's been with us a very long time. And one of the pieces I've made that's really focused around this is called Ex Voto, and they're actually secular votives that are based on, each one is drawn either by me or by lots of different participants, and there are many of them now. And they represent the experiences of the different people of either infectious diseases, taking antibiotics or working with antibiotics. So it's people's stories around antibiotic and bacteria and infectious diseases. So, for instance, some of them are based on kidney infections and different microorganisms. And they're hung on ribbons, which are dyed with different antimicrobial dyes, either natural dyes like turmeric or madder root, which have been used as ancient treatments, or they're dyed with streptomyces, genetically modified streptomyces bacteria that can produce antibiotics. Some are dyed with the Staphylococcus aureus bacteria from my body. Some are dyed with things like Prontosil, a bright orange kind of antibiotic, a bacteriostatic that predates penicillin. So each ribbon, some are dyed with woad as well. So each ribbon is part of the story, and each votive is part of the story as well. And during the lockdown, I started a series of lockdown votives. So one a day from the start of the lockdown until the shops reopened in the UK. So it was a several month period, and each one represents a story of something happening during the lockdown. So the introduction of mask wearing, endless shopping bags and shopping trips and disinfecting the shopping, hand sanitizer, all sorts of things, right down to things like the antibodies being produced, or the increase in people drinking wine, hand washing from soap, the lung infections, turmeric roots, the way the COVID-19 virus binds to things, the swabbing for antibiotic testing, the toilet rolls that became hoarded like mad in the UK, and I think in Australia as well. Clapping for the National Health Service every Thursday. We had a 100-year-old soldier called Captain Tom who was raising money for the NHS, who became a huge hero and raised millions of pounds for the health service, charities. There's even the Starlink satellites which were flying over us and things like that. So these votives, which will all be hung on turmeric dyed ribbons, some of which will hopefully be impregnated with an RNA construct of the COVID-19, the virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, for an extended piece to the Ex Voto project. And the Ex Voto project is an ongoing project, so it responds to different situations and to different projects that I do, and these stories get added into it, and it becomes a much bigger piece that is usually hung above the visitors as they come into the gallery, and you walk under these votives and you can look at everyone's stories. During the early stage of the pandemic, I was starting to work on a commission for Art Data Health at the University of Brighton, which was a project in collaboration with the domestic violence charity Rise in Brighton, and I was scheduled to make some workshops with the staff at the charity dealing with it, and to think about the data around domestic violence. And when the lockdown came, I was literally supposed to, just as the university started to close, this is early March, I was due to be running workshops with the staff at Rise. They'd been scheduled in, but we couldn't do it, and we were very worried what would happen to the project. Would the project have to end? And at that point I started to see stories about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the situation of domestic violence. And at that time as well, you saw many images of the temporary hospitals, like in Wuhan in China, when they started to build the temporary hospitals. They were quite iconic images that really struck me. And I think one of the things that was most strange about it was this idea that the bedding was all different colours. And I think it was like they had to get the bedding from factories and stuff because they needed so many. So the bedding was kind of all cobbled together, these different unmatched sets and things. So they were very brightly coloured, which was quite strange, and almost had a handmade quality, not like the sort of European temporary hospitals, which have this, like, they always had this standard kind of colours and things like that. So this idea was kind of in my mind, and this issue of the fact that women were mainly women in the case of, so Rise worked generally with women, although obviously domestic violence can be a wider issue and it affects children and families and all sorts of, and can happen in lots of different ways. But the situation is that victims of domestic violence were being told to shield in their own homes, or shelter in place, as they say in America, with the perpetrators of violence or abuse that they could normally find respite from, but they couldn't. And also, it was a much more stressful situation. So you actually found possibly that domestic violence or domestic abuse could increase during this time because people were in this very intense, heightened situation. So a lot of the data coming out of this, and I worked with Aristeia Fotopoulou at the University of Brighton, who's the leader on Art Data Health project, and we discussed this data coming out of in lots of press stories from around the world, that kind of suggested that there was almost around a third increase of victims of domestic violence in this. So I made 30 or so of these little beds, which are based on models of the Wuhan hospital beds. So I got help to create these as 3D models, and then 3D printed the beds. All the bedding is handmade by me, and it's this idea of needing a safe space but not having one, and the hospitals being this kind of, in a way, safe space but not a space of your own. I live in Brighton in the UK, and just up the road in Rodmell, very close by, is the former home of Virginia Woolf, the famous writer who is very known for writing the text A Room of One's Own, an extended essay about a kind of feminist essay, saying back in the days when she lived that if a woman wanted to write, in this case she's talking about women basically having autonomy to do something that they wanted to do, they needed to have a room of one's own with a lock on it and an income, a small income, a prior, their own personal income. Obviously she was kind of from a privileged background, but this idea of the room of your own, the safe space, becomes very important in a period like a pandemic. So the hospital is kind of like representing the not a safe space as well. So it's got this kind of conflicted image around it, and the bedding is embroidered, so it's bringing in this kind of feminine techniques. I use natural dyes to dye the pillowcases, which are based on the images of the Wuhan hospital, and I used natural dyes to dye the bedding, and this is turmeric and madder here. And this is where I was working. I was literally working in my sitting room, surrounded by stuff, and laying out the piece across the floor, and the embroideries, they were all being done basically mainly at home, because the studio was closed during the pandemic. And so I haven't managed to exhibit the work just yet, but it's planned to be exhibited in Brighton at the end of September, hopefully, and that's going to be coming up hopefully in some sort of safe and social distanced way that people will be able to see the real installation. I'll be able to film it in the space, which will hopefully be at the Regency Townhouse Gallery kitchen space in Brighton. And the aim with this piece is also to impregnate it. In fact, this is the main aim of this of getting hold of the COVID RNA construct, which I'm working with scientists in Leeds to do this, and it's completely safe because it is just the DNA, and there's no risk there. So it can be exhibited in the way that I exhibit DNA normally, but it will be impregnated in these beds. So people will be able to think about this, and they'll be able to think about the risk. So there's the coziness, so there's this tension in the work between the coziness and the idea of the room of one's own, the personal space, the personalized space, and this dangerous kind of situation that we're still in, and it's ongoing, and it's happening in different parts of the world at different times. At the moment, as I'm recording this, the news stories have really died down around domestic violence, but I'm sure it's still going on at just the same levels. There's been a lot of government support in lots of countries to help with this, but it's something, it needs to come from a grassroots level as well. Another work in that I've been working on during the lockdown is around yeast biotechnology, and we've been looking at ways that yeast can actually, working with Alex May and working with BOKU University, the Institute for Microbiology and Microbial Biotechnology there, with Professor Dr Matanovic, working to explore the history and future of yeast. And yeast's really interesting in that it's this ubiquitous kind of organism that we kind of co-evolved with over time. And even in the COVID-19 pandemic, they're looking at using yeast as an organism to help produce the vaccine, help produce vaccines if indeed we can produce viable vaccines, which at this point in time, there are many candidates which look hopeful, but as I'm recording this, we don't know yet. I've also been working with scientists around chicory, and at the end of last year we were with Alex May again, at the Institute for Plant Science at Wageningen University, and working with Key Gene in Wageningen, studying this plant, which is going to be used, and it's being modified using knockouts in CRISPR DNA editing, but you knock out genes rather than replacing genes. So these are not transgenic organisms; they are gene edited organisms. And so they're looking at this plant, which you can see here. There's this huge root, and this root is really important to produce dietary fibre, something called inulin, which is actually used in a lot of low-calorie foods. When they say reduced sugar, quite often it has inulin in, which is not quite as sweet as sugar, but it's also a really good dietary fibre. So it has some potential health benefits if you eat it. So there's the root, and then this plant is the chicory plant that inspired writers like Novalis and Goethe later in German Romanticism, and it became a kind of the blue flower that they talked about it kind of became a symbol of German Romanticism and an antidote to the Industrial Revolution. There's kind of the direct opposite of the Industrial Revolution. So you had Romanticism on one side and the idea of industrialization on the other side. So this revolution that was happening. And what's so fascinating to me is that now this chicory plant, this blue flower, this important root, which, I mean, yeah, people said things like in folklore, the blue flower is a symbol for the chicory flower is a symbol for the ability to unlock doors that are closed to you. So it's almost like we're unlocking knowledge now by understanding this plant more. And this plant is now central to this issue of the sort of the modern biotechnological revolution. So rather than being a separate thing to the current revolution, it's there right in the heart of it in this much more complex position, which is something we're really interested in exploring at the moment. And we're very interested in kind of what the effects of the pandemic will be on attitudes to synthetic biology, like with the yeast research, like with the chicory research. Will the kind of profusion of stories around infectious diseases and pandemics raise people's interest in this, or will it stop them wanting to be interested in it? Will it make them want to go back to a kind of what we call, and I'm using kind of scare quotes here, natural world, which is fascinating because the idea of natural, what is natural, is something that is very conflicted. Also, during the pandemic, I've been working on another project with Alex May called Susceptible, which is about the research of the CRyPTIC project at Oxford University, who are long-term collaborators of mine, which they stem from the Modernising Medical Microbiology project I've worked with since 2010. And they've just produced a groundbreaking paper that shows that they can now look at the genomes of tuberculosis bacteria from patients, and from that be able to infer successfully which of the first 4 frontline drugs can be used to treat a patient's tuberculosis. So this is combining the genomics for epidemiology and just understanding the disease better with actual diagnostics, which is kind of the first time that this has been done for any bacterium, and offers a sort of basically a methodology for how you might do this for other infectious diseases, for other bacteria. So this is really interesting. So this is a mock-up of how it should look in the gallery. we can't obviously exhibit it at the moment in a gallery. We don't have access to spaces because of the pandemic. But this is how we would like to see the piece. And the idea is that you will interact with the bacteria. And the different antibiotics are these different clouds, and it's the actual data set that the scientists use. But it's also interacting with the person in the gallery or the visitors to the gallery. So the bacteria will cluster to you, and you can kind of guide them to the antibiotics that will work with them. And there are these 3D models of the organism spinning around you and surrounding you. So as you kind of go through it, and you can see these lines that whiz across. This is actually Gatwick Airport data in the UK. So and we had access through this project, which is funded by DRIVA Arts DRIVA at the University of Brighton. We had access to the Gatwick airport data, and we used the origin and destination data of countries which supplied data for the CRyPTIC research. And the story here is that, and this is central to the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic as well, it's not about closing borders and things like that are very limiting for the idea of stopping infection. The important thing is that we really do need to think of health and infectious diseases as a global issue, and we need global collaboration. That's what's so wonderful about the CRyPTIC project. It is global, and you can really see its impact in the piece, because in the data from Gatwick Airport, there's this huge number of planes. This is one of the two top airports in London. Huge number of planes, which all these little dots kind of represent. You can see the bacteria and you can see the dots whizzing through. So there's huge amount of planes, and then there's this enormous drop off to sometimes 6-7 flights a day. So it's very limiting, and it just goes to show this very clearly, this issue. So this is something we're continuing to work with, and I'm continuing to work with tuberculosis and infectious diseases and antibiotic resistance, and I'm very interested in the impact of SARS-CoV-2 on the future. I'm interested in the impact on things like antibiotic resistance, because it's been a really major impact on antibiotic resistance, because you have this situation of, for instance, this is a piece I made that's called The Most Profound Mystery, and it's a bone fan. I made it in collaboration with Birmingham Dental Hospital. And it's grown with the bacteria that cause tooth decay and gum disease. It's called The Most Profound Mystery, which was a quote in the 17th or 18th century to describe false teeth. And the fan's made out of bone, and it's wired together with wire, and it's an antique. But these bacteria on it are present in our mouths all the time, causing all these infections at different levels. But the thing is, during the pandemic, people couldn't get to their dentists, and if they had toothache, if they had tooth infections, what they were given was antibiotics. And this idea of antibiotic stewardship, which is where we're trying to reduce the number of antibiotics we give to people, it becomes, it has gone out of the window. And one of my colleagues, Jane Freeman at the University of Leeds, described it to me as like throwing a bomb at antibiotic resistance, the pandemic, because people are being given prophylactic antibiotics. I mean, they need them. I'm not saying they shouldn't be, but all this work we were doing to try and reduce the use of antibiotics and to be really careful about how antibiotics are used and targeted is just been thrown up into the air. And another piece I made with Jane is called Spindle here. And this is made from, it's an artwork exploring Clostridium infections and Clostridium difficile, which is a gut infection that causes biofilms in the gut, and it's an antibiotic resistant infection that arose as a consequence of antibiotic use. It was actually not a pathogen. The reason it's called Clostridium difficile was it was very hard to grow, not because it's difficult to get rid of, but then in about 1972 it became a pathogen. It gained these antibiotic resistance genes. So we have this issue with the pandemic, and a project that I'm starting at now, and with a lot of scientists and trying to put together, is something that will be an ongoing work that looks at what we've termed the collateral effects of the pandemic. So it's all these things. We know the obvious things, the effects of the economy, death figures, people with the long-term infections and things like that, or the long-term effects of the pandemic. But what about these collateral unseen effects? What about the fact that almost all the scientific research, healthcare science research, especially in infectious diseases, has basically stopped in most parts of the world, definitely in the UK, because those labs have been turned over to work on COVID. And I'm not saying that this is wrong, but it's going to have a huge impact in delaying all those studies that were ongoing. Not only, but it might have other effects. As there are a lot of things arising now that we didn't know about. So new research, new techniques for vaccine production, lots of new research, because it's been such a push. So that's going to have maybe some positive effects as well. And we don't know what those effects are going to be. What are the effects on diseases like cholera, tuberculosis? Tuberculosis, the symptoms that you present with if you have tuberculosis are night sweats, difficulty breathing, a cough, very similar to COVID-19. So the actual diagnostics, it's very difficult to get diagnosed with TB at the moment. So the diagnosis rates of TB have gone right down, not because the disease isn't out there, just because no one is seeking the treatment for it. So obviously we're going to have increases in tuberculosis death rates. And at the moment, as I'm recording this, the death rates globally from tuberculosis on an annual basis equal around the same rates of what we have seen for COVID-19 so far. But that's every year for TB, every year. And it's something we just accepted and we just live with. And it's the same with diseases like cholera. In some parts of the world, you're faced with these diseases and lack of access to medicine and stigma around the disease that it's just on a daily basis. But now this disease has reached the kind of the richer Western world, and we don't like it. We're getting a taste of what quite a large part of the world lives with anyway. And what will happen with that? Will it help our understanding of others? Will it help our understanding of other diseases? Where will we go with this? So I'm really fascinated to understand more about this and to understand more about the future of where we're going and just observe it. I'm not one to make predictions for the future. This is not what I do. I am interested in observing and really carefully looking at what's happening and reflecting on it. And I hope that my future work's going to do that and kind of bring some of these things together and to think about these issues in a kind of holistic way and just see what those collateral effects will be.
Thank you, Anna, for that wonderful talk. Actually, anyone listening should stick around, or at least find the next YouTube link for within the next hour. We're going to start a live discussion between Anna Dumitriu, who you just heard, and Sir Popelka, called Climate Change and Virusphere. And it's going to cover ideas that include citizen science, fluid borders, and how new technologies can aid us at this time. So please go back to the YouTube channel, check out telluricvibrations.com, and also Ars Electronica 2020 to see the full list of all the gardens that are participating. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next hour.